Hey guys, Tyler here with Torwick's Guiding Service. Got another how-to video for you today. I'm going to go over Carolina rigs, something that I throw a lot out here but I haven't done a video on lately. Now right now we're getting into that fall transition period. As you can tell, it's kind of lousy outside, the weather's not very nice. Well, temps are in the 60s. When you start seeing cold fronts like this come through the area that you're fishing, you're going to notice these fish are going to start moving up out of the deep water that they've been in during the summer, and they're going to move to the shallower parts of your lake. Now, there's a couple areas that I recommend you look. First off, if you have your map out, you're going to be looking for secondary points, primary points, drains that are close to the mouth of a large cove. Basically, imagine how the fish have been living offshore, out deep. Now they're starting to make that transition. They're going to use those creek channels, and they're going to pull up onto the first thing that they can find before they move back into the creeks and back into the coves. So main lake points are a really good one and a very easy one for a lot of anglers to find. When you start searching on your map, you'll find those secondary points further out into the lake. Those are going to be good. And then here on Travis, we have a lot of ledges. And oftentimes you'll have a ledge that will turn into a primary point. Places like that are going to be really good. Now, there's a bunch of different things you can throw at them, but one in particular that I like to throw is a Carolina rig. And it's old school. These have been around for a long time. It's nothing new. But for those of you that are not familiar with it, let's take a little bit of time to go over it. Let's start out by discussing setup here. First off, let's go over rod selection. My preferred rod is going to be a DC 804C. This is a Dobbins Champion XP model rod. I love this one. I think they even call it the Carolina Rig Special. Yep. The reason I love this rod is because, one, it's got a lot of backbone. You see it's a pretty thick rod, but it's an 8-foot rod and it's pretty stout. Now, I really recommend getting a dedicated Carolina rig rod. I know there's a lot of applications that you can use, a multi-purpose rod for, but as far as Carolina rigs go, I do think you benefit a lot from having an 8-foot rod for this. Not to say you can't do it with whatever you've got, but the benefits of it are that when you make, a cast, you can really launch it out there and make a really long cast. And Carolina rigs are all about covering water. The other thing, and the biggest reason for it, is hook sets. When you make that long cast and you get a bite really far away from the boat and you go to set the hook, your line's going to stretch. Even with fluorocarbon, there is some line stretch to it. And what happens is you don't necessarily get the greatest of hook sets if you're not able to take back a ton of line. Ideally, you're going to have to reel all the way down and then set that hook. Now, using an 8-foot rod, that's going to allow you to take back more line, which is going to translate into a harder hook set and more fish, land it. This is a 4-power rod, so it's, right there in the middle, so it's not super heavy to where, it's a broomstick, it ain't a flipping stick, but it's got enough tip on it to load up and cast that out there a really long ways. So check this rod out. I think you really like it if you're a Dobbins fan. Again, that's the DC 804. As far as reels go, any reel will work. I do recommend a high-speed reel though, 7.1 or higher. Even an 8.5 Corrado would be a very good reel for this, because when you fish a Carolina rig, you're never reeling it in. Your reel's purpose is only to take up slack or to fight a fish. So because of that, your rod tip is doing all the work for you. Having a high-speed reel just makes it a little bit more convenient to take up that slack when you bring your rod tip back towards your bait as you get ready to drag it. So for me, a 7-to-1 Corrado. I like these old school green ones. These are excellent reels and these will be perfect for it. So don't get too carried away with whatever reel you put on whatever you've got. As far as line goes, I am a little bit picky about that. I like 20-pound test. Out here on Lake Travis, we've got a lot of rocks that are covered in zebra mussel, so having heavier line is going to help with that. You're going to get less break-offs, you're going to land fish. It just all around, I think 20-pound test is the best for this setup. I know a lot of guys like to run braided line, and if the lake you fish allows you to get away with that, I love braid. No stretch, really sensitive. It's great for Carolina rigs. But out here on Travis, you're going to get cut off in those zebra mussels and you're just wasting your money. You're going to be losing so many rigs. So for me, fluorocarbon is the best thing. Another benefit to fluorocarbon is that it's very low visibility, so those fish can't see it as well in the water, and it's very abrasion resistant, which, as I mentioned with the mussels, huge benefit. So you can get away with monofilament, but mono has a ton of stretch, mono floats, mono's a softer plastic, so I would stay away from that. Now let's get into how to set up this rig. So a Carolina rig's not too complicated. You know, a lot of people even use a Carolina rig when they're fishing live bait. So to start with, you've got that 20-pound main line, and I'm going to add a sinker on here. So in this case, I've got a 1-ounce bullet weight. There's a couple different options. I tend to go with a very heavy weight. I always like to go with 1 ounce. If I'm getting snagged too much, I may drop down to a 3/4 ounce. But generally, I go as heavy as I can get away with because I want to be kicking up mud on the bottom, hitting rocks, kicking up sand. You know, I'm trying to get those fish's attention. So for me, I like a bullet weight style like this. You can find these on Tackle Warehouse. The 1 ounce size is a little hard to come by, so you usually have to get those online. But just your traditional egg sinker also works great. These do not come through the rocks quite as easily, but if you're just fishing, you know, underwater humps or, you know, main lake point, something like that that's mostly gravel or sand, egg sinkers work great and they're cheap. These I don't give to clients. This is more something I fish in tournaments or just, you know, when I'm fishing, but tungsten weights work excellent. A tungsten barrel weight like this is a 1 ounce weight, and you can see the size difference in those. So it's a much more compact rig, which that's not necessarily a big deal, but tungsten translates a lot better with sensitivity. So when it hits stuff, you can feel it on the bottom much better than you can with lead, being that lead is very soft. So if you got, you know, Jeff Bezos money, throw some tungsten. Next up, you want a brass clacker and a glass bead. Now, a lot of people just put a bead on here, which is fine, but they make these little brass clackers. It's kind of hard to see, but it's just a small little disc made out of brass. And when you pair it up with a glass bead, they hit each other when you're dragging it along the bottom, and they make a little clicking noise. And that noise I find is very good for either triggering bites, but mainly just getting the fish's attention. Sometimes I will actually run it with a bead up above it, so there's one on either side of it. You know, whatever you feel like doing. And then after that, you're going to want a barrel swivel. So just a small, you know, appropriate size barrel swivel, nothing crazy. As far as leaders go, I actually prefer monofilament for this. I did mention that it's not as abrasion resistant, which is a drawback to it. However, monofilament floats, which fluorocarbon doesn't. Now, when I present a bait, I want it to be higher up off the bottom and not necessarily just down dragging on the bottom. I want this to go, you know, past those fish's face, be a little higher up, trigger that bite. And while mono's not super buoyant and just putting a piece of mono is not going to make your bait float way to the surface, every little bit helps. So I tend to go with a monofilament leader, usually about 15, 14 pound test. Trilene works great. You don't have to get crazy with it. But I generally run about a 2 to 3 foot leader. Now, a little tip when it comes to selecting how long of a leader. Generally about 3 feet is ideal. But if you're graphing, and let's say you go over some fish and you notice that they're suspended or they're higher up and maybe not hugging the bottom, that's when I'll run a really long leader. Sometimes I'll even go as far as like a 4 foot leader. When you do that, select a plastic that floats. There's a variety of plastics out there and most of them have salt in it, so stay away from those. One reason that they put salt in baits, a lot of people, you know, they think it's for scent or something like that. It's cheap. Salt is very cheap and it's a good filler. Jean LaRue, I believe, was the first company to start doing that, and it saves them money. Now, not necessarily makes the bait bad, but salt's dense, salt sinks, just like Senkos. That's a big reason Senkos work so well and have that slow fall is because there's a lot of salt in Senkos. So if you're trying to choose a bait that's going to stay higher up off the bottom, select something that does not have salt in it or even a plastic that's more buoyant. The beauty of a Carolina rig, though, is that you can choose a ton of different plastics. So right now in the fall, a couple recommendations would be either a curl tail worm, like I've been throwing today. These work excellent. That tail on there has got a little kick to it. When you pull it through the water, it gets their attention. Another bait that I throw a lot out here is either a rage craw or a speed craw. As you know, in the fall, those fish tend to feed up a lot on crawfish. And out here on Travis, with all this rock, there's an abundance of them. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll throw like a green pumpkin speed craw or rage craw, whichever, and I'll dip the tips of the little claws in either orange or red spike it. I find that that works often. But when it comes to the bait selection, you know, match the hatch. If you're catching them on, you know, shad, switch over to a fluke. If you're catching them on plastics, you know, go with a curl tail worm, go with a trick worm. You can use Senkos. You know, they do sink, but you can use them, and if you're fishing them fast enough, they'll still stay up off the bottom. So that's one reason I love Carolina rigs, is just the variety of plastics that I can throw on them, and it's very easy to simply take off the plastic and put it on there. I should mention also what type of hooks to use. Now, there's two different kinds of hooks that I like. Pretty straightforward is the EWG hook or the straight shank hook. Now, the way I decide which one I want to use is based off of the type of plastic. So for worms, I like to be able to, actually I kind of contradicted myself here. I had a crawl in here earlier. But generally I use a straight shank hook when it comes to a worm because I like to bury that hook up inside of it. Whereas if I'm using a crawl or something like that, I'll skin hook it on the back. It is a bit of personal preference. Both hooks work great. I will say if I'm in an area that's really rocky or that I'm prone to getting snagged in, I'll use that straight shank hook so that way the hook point is buried inside the plastic instead of, you know, Texpos like this one. Again, both work great. I'm fishing this with a worm, even though I said, you know, that's what I don't prefer to do, but it still works and we've been catching them today on it. So now that you know how to rig it, let's get out there and do some fishing, and let me show you a little bit about how to present the bait and how to effectively work it along the bottom and still maintain bottom contact. So let's first take a sec to look at the map here and give you an idea of what it is we're fishing. So as you can see on the map, we've got a cove here. Now on Lake Travis, you know, every cove has a creek channel in it. Some are much more defined, others is just, you know, the bottom of the cove. But in this case, you can see right here is a creek bend, and then it comes out back into the main lake. Now that forms a point, and right through here, if you look at those contour lines, you see how close they are together. You got a ledge that runs right through here. So we're sitting in 32 feet of water. We're going to be positioning the boat somewhere out in here. I'm going to graph this first. We're going to be casting up here, and you can see I've got these waypoints on it where I've found fish in the past, or I believe there's a brush pile right up here. But anyways, that's what I'm looking for, is this bend in the creek channel, because any of these fish that have been living out deep, this is the first place they can come to if they want to get up shallow and start feeding. So it's a little windy out here. I apologize for the audio, but we're sitting off that point that I showed you on the graph earlier. Now, I'm sitting in about 25 feet of water here, casting up shallow. I graphed this earlier and I saw there's a few fish down there, there's some brush, and then there's a ledge. So, once you've got your Carolina rig all set up, you want to make as long of a cast as possible. Long casts are key to this because you're trying to cover water, right? When you cast it, you want a high lobbing cast. You're not trying to whip cast this thing out there. You'll break them off or you just won't go as far with it. So just a nice high lobbing cast, and then let it take all that line. Let it sink to the bottom. You know, don't put it back in gear, otherwise it's going to swing back towards you. Once it's on the bottom, the key to fishing a Carolina rig is a sweeping motion with it, okay? You're not lifting up with it like you would a Texas rig. So I'll sweep to the side and then I'll pause, and you can feel it, especially with that heavy weight. Let it sink back to the bottom. Drag a little further. And once you get right to about here in your retrieve, pause for a sec, let it sink, but then reel back up. You don't want to go any further, because if you do get a bite and you go to set the hook, you've got no room and you're not going to get a very good hook set. I'd much rather have my rod out in front of me when I'm getting ready to set the hook. So again, I'm dragging it to the side. I'm not reeling. My reel's not doing anything to get ready to fight a fish. That might have been a rock. But you saw when I set the hook, it's more of a sideways motion with it. My motto's always been, hook sets are free. So as you're dragging this thing, you'll be paying attention to the bottom. Typically a bite's going to feel like one hard tap. So you feel the rock right there, the benefit of that heavy weight. But just continue to sweep it to the side. A little tip, if you can sense you're getting a bite, like he's tapping it a little bit, reel down until you're pointed at it, and then get ready to set the hook. That way you've got all that distance to set the hook. That's a big benefit of that 8-foot rod. One other tip for fishing a Carolina rig. When you get a bite, it's always a sweeping hook set to the side. You don't want to set the hook vertically. Reason being for that is you got that big weight down there, and you're having to lift that weight up and then hit the fish with the hook. It's a lot better if you just pull it through that sinker, since your sinker slides, and you just get a nice big sweeping hook set. A lot better hook. Other little tip, if you can sense your and I guarantee you, you're going to catch fish, especially during this fall transition period. Use your electronics, use your mapping, get out there, find places like this, and throw that Carolina rig all day until your arm's sore. Good luck, guys, and thanks for watching.